This is Professor Richard Schuster. I am a professor of global health and co-director of the International I-MPH program at the University of Haifa. I'm giving you a brief introduction to the concepts and some of the major issues of project management. In global health and in public health, many of us spend significant parts of our time proposing, planning, or executing projects. And we thought that it would be useful to have a brief presentation in a structured way about project management. By no means is this comprehensive, and in fact, it's advisable to either take a course that includes project management, take a course in project management, and in fact, there are people who have degrees in project management. So by definition, this will be a short description of the essence of what is project management. Please go to the next slide. As we proceed to talk about project management, the first real question to ask is, what is a project? It's best to define it so that we then can understand it better. And first observation to make is that a project is unique. It is identifiable. It can be separated from other things that are going on. It's transient in the sense that there is a time when a project begins and a time when a project ends. It should be undertaken to achieve planned objectives, which is to say there should be some very specific goals in mind, and those goals should be met by this project. And if it's done properly, it should be defined in terms of outputs, which is to say there should be a product that can be measured. Projects have two other key elements. One is they have a timeline. Not only when does it begin and when does it end, but what happens at various milestones throughout the project. And finally, a budget. Inevitably, a project has to have a separate budget, and all of the issues related to financing of the project, where the money comes from, who manages the budget, who is rewarded by the outcome of the project, are all issues related to finance and are all very important. Please go to the next slide. Experts contend that there are three key issues in project management. These three, which are related to each other and can form a triangle of understanding, are time, cost, and quality. Time, clearly, as we've talked about already, when does this project begin? What happens during the timing of the project? And when does it end? So maybe we'll have a smoking cessation program. It will take 6 months to plan. It will be carried out in 2 years, and then it will end with hopes that the community will be improved and measures are taken at the beginning, during, and end to see if it's been successful. Obviously, cost is critical, and where are the funds coming from? How will they be managed? Who will manage them? And ultimately, what happens after the project ends? Finally, quality. How successful is the project as by measured outcomes? If it's a smoking cessation program, do we reduce smoking by 20%, 50%, 5%? How do we measure that? What do we do if the quality is not as good as we hope? And it's characterized as being triangular because presumably if you can put more time into a project, it will improve the quality. If you put more cost into it, it will improve the quality. If you put in more time, it will increase the cost, and so forth. So all of these are related one to the other. Please go to slide 4. Now we need to look at the major components of a project. First of all, you need to define the reason why a project is necessary. This is critical because usually a project needs to be approved either by a committee, a team, the boss, a funding agency. And so defining that reason can really be critically important. If that reason is not clear, let's say we propose a project to improve the health of the population. Well, that's a very ill-defined project, and how would a funder or the boss look at it? Whereas maybe we would like to reduce obesity in the community, or increase activity, or encourage people to take the stairs instead of an elevator. Those are better defined projects and more easily acceptable. Another component is capturing the project requirements. What needs to be done? What will be delivered? Again, what are the resources and the time scale, as we've talked about? Typically, it's necessary to prepare a business case or a business plan. These projects have costs. Sometimes they're very, very expensive. And they need to be justified. So let's say we're going to have an enhanced influenza vaccine program to try to reduce influenza during the COVID season. What will that really look like? What will the costs be? How much will we save? So forth. The next step is securing organizational agreement and funding, which overlaps with the business case, but basically you have to prepare the business case and then you have to get agreement. In a hospital system that I worked in some years ago, there would typically be 10 or maybe 15 project proposals from which 2 or 3 would be selected. Securing that organizational agreement and the funding associated with it was absolutely required in order to get the project done. Assuming that the project has been supported both politically, organizationally, and then with funding, the project team has to develop and implement a management plan. Who is going to do what on the project, how, over what time, what cost, and so forth. Finally, the next major component is leading and motivating the project delivery team. It's very rare for a project to be conducted by one person. Who's leading the team? Who else is on the team? Does the person leading the team actually control the other people on the team? Are they his or her employees? Are they paid by the budget of the team, or are they loaned by another organization or unit in the organization, in which case the team may be much less successfully structured? So these are the major components of a project. Please go to, now that the project has been approved, the next major components of the project are actually getting it accomplished. So they include managing the project. Again, who manages it, who reports to the manager, how is the management done? Monitoring the progress against the plan. As we will talk more about, a plan of a project is one thing. Actually, what happens is often something else. And the challenge is balancing the two, both as it relates to time and as it relates to budget. And managing the project budget is a critically important phenomenon as well. During the project and actually preceding it, stakeholders need to be involved. And as the project is evolving, those stakeholders who have helped to create and plan the project need to be informed, and they need to continue to support the project. This is critical. if the stakeholders are not involved, all the planning may be of very little value. The provider needs to be managed, which is to say the source of funds. And then finally, once the project is completed, it needs to be closed down in a orderly and controlled fashion. In global health and public health, it's often very frustrating to get funding to do a project which provides ongoing care for a population of people. The project ends, the vaccination program ends, the food program ends, the education program ends, the condom distribution program ends, and then there's what left. That's one of the huge challenges in project management versus a project maybe that involves building a building where the project ends with a ceremony. If the project is more of a traditional public health or global health project, thinking through how this will carry on afterwards is an integral part of the project management. Please go to slide 6. At one level, it may seem that these explanations overlap or maybe even compete with each other. But in understanding about project management, having somewhat different perspectives presented, I believe, is useful to really understand how projects get done. This particular list of steps in project management is a little crisper than some of the other descriptions, such as components or principles, and I think it's worth it to go through them as well. We've talked about the importance of defining a project and breaking it into its component parts. And we're gonna, in a few minutes, we're gonna talk about that in much greater detail. It's critical to develop relationships among the activities. These activities are the various components of a project. So let's say you're going to do again, a smoking cessation program. You want to have advertising on radio or TV or a billboard. Well, who is going to develop that advertising? What are the concepts? It all has to be done in an orderly way. You don't call the radio station to book or pay for time for your commercials until many steps have preceded it. So understanding what activities need to be done and the relationship among them is really important. In formal project planning, then it is necessary to actually draw a network connecting all of those activities. And in a few minutes, we'll talk in greater detail about that. As that network is drawn, time is assigned and cost is assigned to each step in that network. In order to conduct a proper project, again, you have to project or determine what the total time of the project will be. If your funding is for 2 years and your project is going to take 3 years to complete, you've got a problem. So you need to calculate the time for each of the steps of the project. And the longest time is, we'll see in a couple minutes, to get through the entire project is what's called the critical path. And creating that network, that diagram, is often critical to the entire planning, scheduling, monitoring, and controlling of the project. Please go to slide number 7. These principles of project management overlap quite a bit with other things that we have already discussed, so I'm going to run through and just emphasize a few of them. We've talked about project objectives and goals, budgeting, scheduling, and estimating. It's really important to define team responsibilities. Typically with a project, a team is a new group of people who are assembled to work together, and it's very important for the team leader and for the team as a group to decide who's responsible for what. And then the team needs to define milestones. They need to be clearly identified. The timing needs to match up with the milestones and obviously the cost. In spite of the best efforts, it's very common for priorities and goals to change during the project. Let's say you're doing a condom distribution plan for a community in Nicaragua, and you find just before you start that a different organization has come in and done a health education program and includes HIV risk reduction. Will that affect your priorities and your goals, and how do you adjust to it? In the midst of a project, it's really important to be wary that things will change and to be prepared to change them. We've talked about accountability and responsibility, and we've talked about the importance of measuring outcomes. Please go to slide number 8. There are a variety of tools that are used in project management. The simplest is probably what's called the Gantt chart, and you'll hear people talk about a Gantt chart. This is an example of one. You can go onto the internet and find all sorts of other examples. But as you can see, for this project, there's a timeline, start to finish, and then each component of the project is identified, and a length of time is assigned to it, putting it on a calendar. Therefore, the team first of all develops what is essentially the y-axis, identifying the various measures or steps or goals, and then the timing is on the effectively the x-axis. And then as the project proceeds, you can see what the time schedule is versus what in fact is happening. Gantt chart is very valuable in either keeping on time or finding out how much you're getting behind schedule. Please go to the next slide, number 9. Some projects are extremely complex, and it's sometimes very valuable having a highly structured, detailed project plan. And there are complex tools that you can adopt that can be very valuable depending on the detail of the complexity of the plan. One of them is called the PERT, Program Evaluation and Review Technique. This was originally developed for a US Polaris missile submarine development process. You can imagine that the process of developing a new missile, nuclear missile that comes flying out of a submarine through the seawater up into the air, landing wherever you want it to land, would be an extraordinarily complex project. And all the steps involved, the years that would be involved in that project were very carefully developed. And the tool that was developed was the Program Evaluation and Review Technique. Basically, what a team does is they identify each of the critical steps that need to be done. Step 1, step 2, step 3, and so forth. They are usually named or numbered. And then each step has to be identified as to what needs to precede it and what needs to succeed it. And if you look at this particular chart, then from step 1, you must go to step 2, and from step 2 to step 3, but also you have to go from step 2 to step 6. And each of those steps takes a certain amount of time. So as you proceed along with your planning, you calculate the time from one step to the next. And that, in turn, requires that you develop what is called the critical path. And the critical path is taking the absolute longest times for each step and adding them up. So in this case, the critical path is highlighted. It's 2 days, 6 days, 4 days, and 2 days, or 14 days total to go from step 1 to step 8. One critical point that is made here is that as you go from step 1 to step 2, you can simultaneously go from step 1 to step 4. Some steps do not need to be done serially, they can be done in parallel. And then when step 2 and step 4 are completed, then while step 3 is being done, step 5 is done, step 6 is done, and then step 2 can connect to step 6, and so forth. This is complicated to explain and not so easy to understand either. If you want to really understand it, then there is value in really reading about the PERT process. Please go to slide 10. This is another example of a PERT diagram. It's a little more complicated than the previous one, but actually also simpler in many ways than the more complex ones that one sees in project planning. But at least it gives you an idea of how these diagrams are developed. And again, if you're called upon to develop a really complex project, having a diagram, a PERT diagram or something like it, can be really useful. In the meantime, for the purposes of this discussion, what you at least need to hear about is what is a PERT diagram. As people talk about it with project planning, at least you will have heard of it. Please go to slide 11. I will only briefly talk about the critical path method. This is called CPM, and it goes to another level of complexity. I will be providing some reading, and you can read more about CPM if you want to learn about it. Simply put, with a CPM, the time it takes to get this project done is known. The cost is also known. The real issue with the CPM is, do you do it with normal time and cost, or do you do crash time and crash cost? Obviously, if you want to compress the time, then the cost goes up. Let's take an example of this and talk about the development of a vaccine for coronaviruses. So if you look, there have been various research institutes that have worked on things like the SARS-1 virus vaccine, and given the normal course of events, would probably take maybe 10 years to develop a vaccine for a coronavirus, which would then be adaptable to, let's say, SARS-3 or even SARS-2, the current coronavirus producing COVID-19. But as you can see, governments around the world, for their own purposes, have decided that they don't want a vaccine in 10 years, they want it in 6 months. So the critical path method says, okay, fine, it's a crash time. Now there's a crash cost. You want it faster, we'll do it faster. The cost will increase by many-fold. The CPM method is a tool that allows project manager to actually go through a process where they can calculate what the time frame is going to be and what the costs are going to be. Please go to slide 12. As I was reviewing and preparing for this presentation, I came upon these comments by a guy named John Kinzer, who has summarized what he calls the top 10 laws of project management. And I'm going to go over them. They are somewhat humorous in some ways, but also incredibly pertinent to remember as you proceed with your project. Augustine's Law, number 1. A bad idea executed to perfection is still a bad idea. You want to avoid groupthink and you want to make sure that the project is a good idea to begin with. It's not going to get better as it proceeds if it's initially a bad idea. Lakin's Law. Failing to plan is planning to fail. You cannot do a good project without laying out all the details, all the steps involved. If you don't, you can predict that the money will be wasted, the time will be wasted, and the service will not occur. Saint Exupéry's Law. Perfection is achieved not when there is nothing more to add, but when there is nothing left to take away. Fitzgerald's Law. There are 2 states to any large project: too early to tell and too late to stop. And the 5th one, we have 5 more to go. Parkinson's Law, very well known and understood. Work expands to fill the time available. Really important to remember as you're proceeding with your project. Please go to slide 13. We are reviewing John Kinzer's 10 top laws of project management. Law number 6 is Constantine's Law. A fool with a tool is still a fool. Graham's Law. If they know nothing of what you are doing, they suspect you are doing nothing. This speaks to the importance of communicating with your stakeholders, making sure that they're actively involved. Most people know Murphy's Law. If anything can go wrong, it will. And in project management, that is so common and really important to build into your planning, your budget, your time schedule, because things will go wrong. Obrachta's Law. Project management is about applying common sense with uncommon discipline. And now Mr. Kinzer, who started this whole thing, in his last, the 10th law, about the time you finish doing something, you know enough to start. Interesting concept. Please go to slide 14. As I have said, this is really a brief introduction to project management. The design of this presentation is to just outline for you some of the key components of a project, to caution you about starting a project without really understanding these key principles in management approaches, and finally, to introduce you to some key terms and concepts of project management that at least you will have heard of. And if you get into doing more projects, you'll become more familiar with. Thank you for your attention. This is Richard Schuster at the University of Haifa.